Hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about how Hereditary and the Babadook personify or externalize grief through their use of monsters and the paranormal, allowing for a more complex exploration of grief. First, we are going to dive into how the monsters appear in these films. Crittenden states that the horror films under discussion use an unexpected monster as an effective way to represent the experience of grief. There is a parallel between the disruptive experience of grief for the bereaved and the disruptive effect of a monster's entry into the protagonist's life, which I think is just a good quote to begin everything with. So in The Babadook, we begin with Samuel's birthday approaching and Amelia's grief really growing as this time approaches, since Samuel's birthday and the day her husband passed away are the same day. As she goes to read him a bedtime story one night after checking for monsters in his room, Samuel chooses the Babadook. Amelia asks where it came from, and he just says the shelf. They begin to read it, and it's evidently scary, which upsets Samuel. Later on, Amelia looks at the book again and decides to hide it for the time being. Samuel becomes obsessively afraid of the Babadook as time goes on, and Amelia decides to destroy the book. All of this points to some form of repression and denial, often associated with grief. The book just randomly appearing into their lives, as the Babadook itself does, closely resembles the way that Amelia randomly lost her husband and grief appeared unexpectedly. Now, where it really hits home is when the book reappears on Amelia's doorstep after being destroyed, all put back together and with more disturbing things added to it. Specifically, the bit about, quote, "the more you deny, the stronger I get." Aranjuez says that, quote, "the reappearance of Mr. Babadook powerfully evokes psychoanalysis founder Sigmund Freud's notion of the return of the repressed. According to this concept, when an individual neglects to work through trauma, grief, or some other negative emotion, instead of burying it deep into the subconscious, it can resurface, sometimes in a stronger or more destructive form." Crittenden also says the book now contains new pages informing Amelia the creature will become stronger if its existence is denied. One interpretation of this plot point we suggest is that it represents the notion that attempting to deny or suppress one's grief is not sustainable. By creating a physical book and being to represent grief, the repression and denial are visualized and explored in a new way that physically shows that grief sustains and returns unless it is confronted. Through the book's added drawings, we also see the foreshadowing of the psychological and physiological destruction that will ensue without confronting something painful. Now getting into Hereditary, the film begins at Annie's mother's funeral, which is all a bit off. Her speech about her mother is dry and distant, not this endearing, loving, "we'll miss you" one would expect. Then Annie's daughter Charlie dies in an accident that her son Peter gets into. So immediately we start with two deaths and the family falling apart. The supernatural really enters the picture when Joan, a friend of Annie's from a support group, sets up a seance to contact Charlie that works. As objects move and Ghost Charlie draws in her sketchbook, these physical manifestations of her bring Annie comfort in her grief until things go dark. Kathleen Higgins says that the ghost's nebulousness is itself reflective of one's unstable condition in bereavement, in which one fluctuates between feeling that the deceased is present and that he or she is absent, or present by virtue of the palpable absence. The ghost figure builds in this simultaneous sense of presence and absence, along with other confusing notions that complicate the bereaved person's sense of the person who has died. The person's independence of efforts to hold on, the lack of location, the privileged epistemic vantage, and possible emotional estrangement. Even though things get dark, watching a physical manifestation of someone she has lost so unexpectedly and tragically, and being able to communicate with her in some capacity brings her comfort in a time of deep pain. Her world was completely turned upside down, and in this, she can find relief. Second, we are going to look at the possessions that happen in these films and what they explore in relation to grief. So multiple possessions happen in both of these films, and my analysis has led me to believe that they express the same message, physically showing grief becoming all-consuming. In Hereditary, the first possession comes in a seance to contact Charlie. Charlie possesses Annie, speaks through her, and Annie's husband throws water on her to get it to stop. In this moment, I believe grief has completely taken over Annie and that she is all consumed in it. Her family has fallen apart, she's lost a child, she's lost her mother, and all she wants is connection and stability, which are nowhere to be found. Crittenden says there's no way of knowing if this is the real world or an imagined one, and this uncertainty continues throughout the film, reflecting the psychology of the characters as they waver from grief, anger, and fear to possession, unable to determine the veracity of their own perceptions or how much choice they have in their words or actions. This contact gives her some form of comfort, but can also deepen the grief. This is what she has to do to feel connected. The absence of her child becomes much more real. The disruptions to her world are unbearable. A lack of control in all consumption may really settle in this moment. I also think Peter's possession is really important. He caused Charlie's death. His mother blames him. His father's not much of a help. He's not sleeping well because of nightmares. He smokes to escape, but ultimately he is haunted by this grief, which is manifesting in a physical ghost now. So when the possession happens, I would think it's fair to come to the conclusion that he has been swallowed whole by his grief and doesn't know how to deal with it. He isn't confronting it, so it grows and grows until it takes over. In the Babadook, there are a few different possessions, but I particularly wanted to look at the one of Amelia tied up in the basement with Samuel. When she wakes up tied up, she goes through a range of emotions, laughing and wailing and crying. She tries to strangle her son, but is snapped out of it when he touches her face. She then has a fun little head freak-out thing, and finally expels black liquid. Here, I see her grief finally beginning to be confronted. First, it has consumed her to the point of possession, being unable to control her emotions, and her resentment for her son takes over as well, which leads to the strangling. But when she has the moment of comfort from him, she's able to expel enough of this grief to keep fighting, to try to confront it once and for all. Again, seeing this done in a physical way brings the emotional turmoil to the outside and explores the depths of this pain in a way that we can't necessarily do in reality. My overall point here is that if these monsters are an external form of grief, then the possessions seem to be a way that the grief takes over. Finally, we're going to look at the endings of these films and what exactly they're trying to express about grief. So this ties in a little bit to my last point. At the end of Hereditary, Annie is possessed again, and wow, is that a sight to see. However, I would argue that her grief has gone unconfronted for so long that it leads her to constant possession. She cannot confront it, and it continues to consume her until she is no longer. While Annie is possessed, Peter is still trying to escape her, and is in turn still avoiding and not confronting his own grief, which leads to his ultimate crowning as Payman. The message I take from the ending is that if grief goes unconfronted and denied, it will grow to a point that completely takes over, disrupts, and destroys. By exploring this idea through physical possession and physical manifestations of grief, viewers get to see the physical and emotional consequences of unchecked grief play out in a very extreme, gruesome, unsettling way. Miller and Lee say that defeating, evading, or taming the monster requires the protagonist to accept its existence, which is often denied for much of the story, and confront the monster, mirroring the protagonist's need to accept the reality of their loss and learn to live in an irrevocably altered world. In Hereditary, the monster isn't evaded, tamed, or defeated in the end. The monster wins, and that monster is grief. The Babadook conveys a different message, but still one about confronting grief. In the end, Amelia is in her bedroom and must confront the Babadook, who takes the form of her late husband, saying his final words to her. She is confronted with the most painful moment of her life and completely breaks down. The Babadook then takes its dark, scarecrowish form again and grows larger and larger. It tries to suck Samuel away into the dark. She tells it that it is trespassing in her home, and she releases a final guttural scream that reduces the Babadook to a heap of clothing, and it flees to the basement where it continues to live over the years, and in fact, Amelia feeds it worms. The confrontation allowed Amelia to take back control and move forward. As Miller and Lee note, it is notable that Amelia never destroys the Babadook, but instead captures it. The Babadook has not left Amelia. The creature is now a permanent fixture of her life. However, she is now in control. The message here is that we must confront our grief in order to move forward. We cannot eliminate grief, but we can accommodate it, like Aranwaz says. She is able to feed her grief, nurture it, give it some attention without letting it consume and control her any longer because she stopped suppressing it. Okay, and that's it for me. Thank you for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed.